In the synopsis, you may have read that I intend to discuss a brief history of the modern systems of seaworthiness and airworthiness and the critical events that have shaped their structure. I'll start with a brief overview of what regulation and assurance are and why we do them, as well as provide some context familiar with our everyday personal and professional lives. I'll then cover the beginnings of modern regulation in defence, which started with the development of the technical airworthiness regulations. We'll discuss the first of our major events with the tragic fire on board HMAS Australia and the subsequent Board of Inquiry, before very briefly outlining the Navy technical regulatory system that was, at least in part, devised in response to this tragedy. From there, we'll discuss the second major shaping incident, this time on the airworthiness side with the crash of Sea King Shark 02 in April 2005, before introducing what is the current and modern system of airworthiness management within the ADF, the Defence Aviation Safety Authority. I'll then transition back to seaworthiness to discuss the events of early 2011 and Cyclone Yasi and the near grounding of HMAS Canimbla on North Head, events which initiated the RITSO review, which has been the single biggest shaping factor in modern day seaworthiness regulations that the Royal Australian Navy operates within today. I'll then provide you an overview of this system, both the regulations and how we assure them. And finally, I'll close with my views on both worthiness systems, how they differ, and perhaps why, before taking questions. Okay, introducing some of the key concepts before we begin. I won't bother reading them to you. I note that they're relatively self-explanatory, but they are worth highlighting. The definitions are drawn from the UK Better Regulation Task Force of 2003. It shouldn't surprise anyone in this room that both regulation and assurance are not free goods. They require energy and resources, financial, time, and human thought and capacity. So why do we do it? In reality, regulation is a natural and inherent part of human society. For our society to function and advance, there is a need to shape, control, and change the behaviour of people. The reality is that most parts of our lives are either informally or formally regulated to some degree. What we wear, units of time, distance, and weight, how fast we drive, the food we eat, etc. Regulation is enforced through assurance. While some people consider assurance activities a burden or a constraint on their free will, others appreciate the clarity and efficiency that regulation provides in an increasingly complex world. Society does this for mostly benevolent and practical reasons, such as to assure personal safety, create order, and reduce transactional costs. As important as why we do it is where we do it, particularly when we are discussing the instigation of formal regulations. Typically, we introduce regulations to protect society from a negative outcome that otherwise is less likely to be controlled. This can be because of a number of reasons. Market forces do not provide the required outcome. Think monopolies. There are negative externalities, impacts on third parties. Think mandatory compulsory third-party insurance, vice voluntary comprehensive car insurance. We also do it when there are high costs of controls to prevent corner cutting and provide a consistent standard. And finally, we regulate where there is a knowledge asymmetry, typically in technically complex fields where we work every day. In the last example, think of the transactional costs to society if ferry construction and maintenance weren't regulated and punters had to form their own assessment of the seaworthiness of the Manly ferry each and every time they boarded. Or similarly, whenever we fly anywhere, we trust that the airlines are safe, not necessarily because it's in their commercial interests, but because CASA assures us that they are. Finally, regulations are shaped by what's important to us, and this is often heavily influenced by seminal events. Take, for example, the Exxon Valdez environmental disaster. On the 2nd of March, 1989, the very large crude carrier Exxon Valdez ran aground, penetrating her single hull and discharging an approximate 250 to 750,000 barrels of crude oil into Prince William Sound, Alaska. This event occurred in pristine regional Alaskan wilderness, causing immense environmental damage. The resulting litigation and cleanup costs well over $3 billion with continued effects. It was the largest oil spill disaster in the US until the Deepwater Horizon, and has remained the largest due to bulk crude transport. In response, the US passed the Oil Pollution Act of 1990, which excludes single-hull tank vessels of 5,000 tonnes or more from US waters, which in turn led to the European Union banning single-hull tankers from 2010. This led to the adoption of double hulling as the new standard for this class of shipping, despite its increased complexity and costs. In 2009, the 900-foot oil tanker SKS Satilla struck a submerged jackup rig in the Gulf of Mexico. The US Coast Guard reported that despite sustaining significant damage and taking on an 8-degree list to port, an environmental disaster was averted because the vessel was constructed with a double hull and the inner hull was not breached. All 1.3 million barrels of oil were safely offloaded. Another example can be found in the introduction of regulations to curb an increasing road toll over time. The gradual decline of deaths per capita and some of the seminal shaping events and regulations that have impacted it are evident. I acknowledge that not all of this is due to changes in regulations. There have been vast improvements in vehicle safety, also driven by market forces, think Volvo. Regulation and assurance have, however, have undoubtedly been significant contributing factors. It would be remiss of me as the director of an assurance agency not to highlight the critical importance of the assurance function as it works to augment the desired impacts of regulation. Without police to enforce our road rules, it's likely that compliance would be significantly less. You will all remember the events surrounding the ceiling insulation grants, which led to a flood of the market of poor practices in the installation industry, which, whilst regulated, was largely unassured. I'll now move into the defence-specific realms of regulations and worthiness, and I'll start with airworthiness, as it was the first of the modern regulatory frameworks. This is a chart illustrating the total number of defence aviation assets from defence aviation accidents from 1980 to now. The bars represent the number of aircrafts lost, blue as non-fatal losses, and red as fatal aircraft accidents. The numbers above the bars represent the number of lives lost in a calendar year due to those accidents. If you focus on the early years leading up to 1990, it is evident that the aircraft accidents were a regular feature, to the point that they were considered the cost of doing business within defence aviation. 1991, in particular, was a seminal year with the loss of 6 aircraft, all fatal. That year, the ADF lost a Boeing 707, an F-18 Hornet, a Nomad aircraft, a P-3C, a PC-9A, and a Pilatus Porter. But more importantly, we lost the lives of 15 servicemen and women. If you look at the data from the perspectives of those sitting within defence aviation in 1991, the trend is confronting and unarrested. This commenced a range of reviews and initiatives to improve the safety record of defence aviation, including, most importantly, from our perspective, the introduction of the Defence Technical Airworthiness Authority and Regulator. In 1997, the position of the Director General of Technical Airworthiness was established and appointed as the Technical Airworthiness Regulator within the ADF. The organisation set about promulgating the Technical Airworthiness Regulations, the Technical Airworthiness Management Manual, the Aviation Design Requirements Manual, amongst other important regulatory documents. Despite being constructed as a best-in-class regulatory suite, the system was not without issues. It was an amalgam of best practice from all 3 services, which meant it was bespoke, and as such, very difficult and complex to maintain. It was also very prescriptive and rules-based, as opposed to more modern goal-oriented or outcome-based regulations. But notwithstanding these relatively minor detractors, the TA regs established the first system across defence that governed how aircraft were designed, built, maintained, and operated to approve standards by qualified and authorised personnel using approved procedures to ensure safety of flight. These would form the cornerstone of defence aviation regulation for nearly 2 decades and would come to provide the building blocks for the Navy technical regulatory system. But not yet, not without impetus. On the morning of the 5th of May, 1998, which is 25 years ago on Friday, a fire broke out in the engine room of HMAS Australia as she was proceeding to sea off the coast of Fremantle. Shortly after a fuel leak was detected in the engine room, a fireball extending some 2 metres erupted in the main machinery space. This was followed by repeated fireballs. Both evacuation of personnel and firefighting efforts were made extremely hazardous by the intensity of the fire. The heat of the fire caused metal doors to buckle, making them inoperable, and the degree of heat in the metal on the railings of the escape ladders and the deck plates caused contact burns. Visibility was reduced to 0 as the air was permeated with smoke and toxic gases. Hot plastic dripped from the light fittings that fell on personnel as they fought the fire. Conditions in the main machinery space eventually deteriorated to the extent that all personnel had to be evacuated. 4 Navy personnel were overcome by toxic fumes and smoke and perished in the fire. Able seaman Philip John Carroll, Leading Seaman Bradley John Meek, Midshipman Megan Ann Pelly, Petty Officer Sean Damien Smith. Megan was a classmate of mine from ADFA. The photos that you see are, on the left, Westralia, receiving aid from HMAS Success's embarked Sea-King helicopter and a tug deployed from HMAS Sterling. On the right is a photo of the main machinery space bulkhead, just adjacent to the starboard engine where the fire first initiated. Shortly after the accident, a board of inquiry was convened to ascertain the causal factors. The board found that the fire was caused by fuel spraying under pressure from a hole in a newly fitted flexible fuel hose to the starboard main engine, coming into contact with hot machinery components. The item on the left is a picture of a ruptured NZ hose similar to that fitted, and on right is it in situ, above the standard rigid fuel line that was specified and normally fitted. The newly flexible fuel hoses were fitted by a subcontractor to ADI Limited during March and April of 1998. The flexible fuel hose change to the main engines was a configuration change which bypassed the prescribed processes. It was not approved by the appropriate authorities and did not comply with the Lloyd's Register of Shipping requirements. Although the hoses were capable of withstanding the expected static system pressure, the arrangement was poorly engineered and the design did not take into account dynamic considerations. The board made 114 recommendations, and in doing so, it attempted to take a broad view of the systemic causes as well as the specifics of the flexible hoses. The BOI concluded that the weaknesses identified were symptomatic of wider problems within the RAN and within ADI Limited. In analysing the decision to replace the rigid fuel pipes with flexible hoses, the board found that there was no competent authority, either within the Royal Australian Navy or the project manager ADI, which critically examined the wisdom of the intended course of action. It concluded that key personnel within the RAN, and more particularly within ADI Limited, were not adequately trained or qualified for the responsibilities placed upon them. On configuration management, the board considered that the avoidance of the formal configuration change process was likely widespread through the RAN. Although no real evidence of widespread abuse was presented, the issue is of significant concern, and it suggested that a review of the process was warranted. On quality assurance, the board found that the principal organisations involved in the fuel hose work, which is ADI Limited, NZ and the Ordering Authority of Western Australia, were all accredited to a quality standard, but that the quality management systems in place were either inadequate or inadequately implemented to prevent the provision of non-conforming product. It further identified that part of the problem seemed to be due to a lack of both rigour by external and internal quality auditors. On technical expertise, the board identified that lack of knowledge displayed by some personnel was not so much a reflection on them personally, but an indication of an inadequate system. The inadequacies principally related to training and the selection of key personnel. In response to the Australia Board of Inquiry and in concert with direction from the CDF to establish 3 environmental regulators, by 2002, the Navy Technical Regulatory System was promulgated. The NTRS was modelled from the successful Technical Airworthiness System, specifically the Technical Airworthiness Regulations. As such, it carried some of the same hallmarks of complexity and prescriptiveness, but was further undermined by considerable under-resourcing compared to that of the DGTA organisation. It also suffered from a perceived lack of regulatory teeth in exercising its remit. In aviation, if an organisation loses its authorisation, it stops work. In the maritime environment, the outcome was less clear, potentially due to a perceived risk difference between the two environments. When a vessel suffers a failure, it is typically benign and recoverable. When an aircraft suffers a failure, things have a very high potential of ending catastrophically. Such was the case in 2005 when Sea-King Shark 02 crashed on Nias Island. On the 2nd of April 2005, a Royal Australian Navy Sea-King helicopter Shark 02 crashed on the island of Nias in Indonesia, whilst participating in an Australian Defence Force humanitarian aid operation, causing the tragic death of 9 Australian Defence Force members and severely injuring 2 more. The subsequent Board of Inquiry determined that the primary cause of the accident was a failure of the flight control system, caused by separation of the fore aft bell crank from the pitch control linkages in the aircraft's mixing unit. The mixing unit couples and directs pilot input controls to the main and tail rotor systems of a helicopter. This separation was the result of a series of errors and non-compliances with the maintenance regulations, which ultimately led to the deficient fitment of a split pin and nut that secured the pivot bolt of the fore aft bell crank to the mixing unit assembly. The deficient fitment was not detected because a quality inspection was not conducted. The maintenance activity occurred some 57 days before the accident. The board found that on the 4th of February 2005, 817 Squadron maintenance personnel made errors in securing the fore-aft bell crank and violated maintenance regulations by not properly documenting or conducting mandatory quality inspections. The specific unscheduled maintenance activity was characterised by a series of errors, oversights and inadequate supervision, repeated non-compliances with maintenance regulations, poor communication and coordination within the watches. It was established by review of maintenance audits, technical investigations and maintenance safety reports that maintenance error and non-compliant maintenance practices were recurrent and existed in 817 Squadron well before the accident. It further found that these indicators provided warning of deficient standards, but they were regarded as separate and isolated incidents and were not acted upon. Because no engineering discussion is complete without a schematic, the image on the left shows the fore-aft bell crank within the mixing unit. From the exploding view, you can see split pin number 52 was the uninstalled item that allowed castellated nut 53 to come adrift, eventually allowing bolt 55 to work free over 57 days of operations, in effect, disconnecting the pilot's fore and aft flight control inputs from the main rotor head. The image on the right is how they were found within the accident debris. The mixing unit is on the bottom and the bell crank is above. They should have been connected. The board found a complex interaction of individual and systemic failings across the ADF. It made 256 recommendations in total, all of which were accepted. Whilst the individual recommendations are too numerous to cover in this discussion, some major themes were identified. On non-compliant practices, the board found that the extent of regulation violations within 817 Squadron was surprising. Many violations, especially with regard to aircraft maintenance documentation, were accepted shortcuts. The condoning of such shortcuts by supervisors and managers led to maintenance teams unwittingly bypassing many safety devices. Communication deficiencies were evident between individuals, work teams and ADF organisations. These led to poor logistic support, poor safety risk management and misunderstandings within the maintenance teams on the status of maintenance work and inspections. There was misunderstanding and ignorance of the rationale behind adherence to regulations and approved procedures, which meant that personnel were more ready to adopt workarounds to get the job done. The board saw evidence of achievement of compliant but not necessarily safe outcomes. Despite annual achievement of Australian military type certification, service release and authorised maintenance organisation certification, 817 Squadron was a high-risk maintenance environment. A sophisticated airworthiness system ensured certification of the Sea-King aircraft system through both engineering and maintenance processes, but it did not prevent the accident. It was clear to the board that the most senior managers did not fully understand their airworthiness management responsibilities, particularly with regard to technical airworthiness. Clear accountabilities were not understood, nor were they established. Significant deficiencies were also found in audit and surveillance processes, and the board saw that a review of the airworthiness management system was a timely requirement, which brings us to our contemporary systems. In 2011, Defence commenced a sweeping review into best practice of aviation safety regulation to both address the recommendations of the Board of Inquiry and also to satisfy the legal obligation placed on duty holders by the new workplace health and safety legislation. The review identified that the TA regs had evolved organically over 20 years. However, they had not evolved in line with contemporary principles in regulation, which had seen a shift from a rules-based prescriptive system to a goal-based and hazard-focused system. The review found specifically that the technical airworthiness regulations were highly prescriptive with very limited flexibility provisions beyond an undesirable exemption from the regulations. It also found that the system was internationally isolated and unable to recognise or be recognised by other partner nations. The TA regs, as bespoke and unique regulations, were also extremely onerous to maintain. Finally, the board experience highlighted the requirement for the airworthiness regulations to be credible and defensible in a legal context as best practice regulations, driving the requirement to look further afield to identify what international best practice was. The review settled on the European Aviation Safety Authority and its European Military Aviation Regulations, the EMARS, as the basis for the new Defence Aviation Safety Regulations. And in 2016, the CDF and Secretary announced the establishment of the Defence Aviation Safety Authority. The new regulations, promulgated by DASA, are based on an internationally recognised framework adopted by the European Airworthiness Safety Authority and aligned with the FAA. It critically provided the clear lines of accountability that the Seeking Board of Inquiry had found so lacking, and identified Command as responsible for ensuring safety and the Safety Authority as responsible for assuring safety. The regulations were structured to be largely outcome focused, with prescribed means of compliance and the ability to demonstrate alternate means of compliance where required. The regulations were hazard-based, and every regulation is designed to control a hazard. From an assurance perspective, success is measured not in the binary of compliance or not, but in the effectiveness of a system to control the underlying hazard. It also enshrines the concept of risk-based assurance, where the level of assurance applied is assessed against the risk of an unsafe event occurring. This allows for the effective application of the assurance resource to those areas deemed most in need of attention and support. Finally, it's worth pointing out that the regulations are safety-centric. Just as CASA isn't interested in the profitability of an airline, DASA and the DASARs do not regulate operational effect. It is quite possible for an aircraft to be considered airworthy and safe without a single functioning mission system and unable to perform anything but the most basic of safe flight. So as we reach the present day in our revision of aviation regulations, I'll reintroduce this chart. This time overlaid with the systemic regulatory and safety system improvements that have been introduced since 1991. As with the road toll, not all safety gains are due to the highlighted systemic changes, but I am confident that they contribute significantly. Whilst aviation regulation was enjoying some successes, the Navy technical regulatory system was less so, headlined very publicly by the Navy's failing at the time of Cyclone Yasi. I'll take this opportunity to give you all a break from me now and allow some former Chiefs of Navy and Head of Navy Engineering to provide their thoughts on the events leading up to and subsequent to the establishment of our new Defence Seaworthiness system.
The original concept behind establishing the seaworthiness system was to ascertain whether the ship and all of the systems that work to get the ship to sea are actually in place and operating effectively. In late 2009, I invited a number of retired senior officers so that they were independent from the chain of command to come in and establish a seaworthiness board. We had understood that there was a need to revise the culture in our Navy. We needed to fundamentally look at where we were going and how we were going to prepare the Navy's workforce for our future capability.
The path to Cardwell is a trip of escalating destruction. Mighty trees that have stood for generations have been felled.
Cyclone Yasi arrived on the northern Queensland coast. Now, it was one of the biggest cyclones we've had. Naturally, there was a call for support to the local community.
Yeah, where's the people? Where's some help? Yeah, we need help.
Navy's 2 LPAs were unavailable. We looked at the other part of our amphibious capability, which was HMAS the Brook, and regrettably she was not available either because it had some significant engineering challenges and maintenance had not been conducted as well as it should have been. Therefore, we were unable to provide any of the larger ships to Cyclone Yasi support.
I was serving in Headquarters Joint Operations Command at the time, and the response to that event was we needed to get people and assets to the Queensland coast as quickly as we could. And when it came time to sail, we were simply unable to achieve what we had thought we could do. So Russ had a difficult time in not just managing the operational aspects of ensuring that we had capability there. He had to deal with the political difficulty of explaining why Navy could not respond to Cyclone Yasi in the way that was expected of us.
Historically, we saw that Navy had often delivered on its operational requirements at the expense of the technical integrity of our equipment, our major ships.
If you've got unseaworthy platforms trying to conduct naval operations, then you're not going to achieve your operational aim.
We were responsible for producing ships that were mission ready to go to sea to meet government's requirements.
Yasi helped get a more public focus on the need for Navy to re-establish its Navy technical regulatory system through a seaworthiness system and the establishment of the seaworthiness boards.
To show that we could make sound decisions, risks managing the operations that we had to do.
With the failure of our capability to be able to respond, the Minister set in place an inquiry known as the Rizzo report.
It's clear from Mr. Rizzo's report that Navy's engineering capacity has in recent times not been up to the mark. It's also clear that Navy and the Defence Materiel Organisation's engineering capacity have nowhere near the resources to do the job required of keeping modern ships at sea.
Paul Rizzo's review landed on my desk in my first month as Chief of Navy. It was called the Plan to Reform Support Ship Repair and Management Practices. But it was really so much more than just about support ships. I mean, it was support ships that was the catalyst for the review. While that's what he looked at, it was pretty evident to him and to everyone else, the challenges that we had in maintenance and sustainment of our surface fleet was not confined to our support ships. That's where it might have manifested itself in terms of Cyclone Yasi, but it was a blueprint to overhaul our entire thinking around technical integrity, maintenance and sustainment generally, which of course was wrapped up in the whole concept of seaworthiness.
There needed to be something more significant, something more systemic that would give us confidence that these things would not recur. It was not at a band-aid tactical level. That's where seaworthiness management as a concept was born.
The seaworthiness management system was created so that we had a much more sustainable operational outcome that considered both the technical integrity of our ships and our people.
It wasn't just a series of documents. It wasn't just a series of senior members who were deciding how the ships would be operated. It was to ensure that everyone knew they had a place in the seaworthiness chain of management. I use the example of the LHD, where we had problems after they'd been operating. We were able to use seaworthiness decisions to bring the ship back because we had a view that we needed to fix this problem now to extend the life of the ship over its entire operating cycle, and that we needed to understand the relationship between operations and sustainment. And it was impractical and indeed negligent to put all your effort only into achieving the here and now without consideration for what it meant for the future.
I see the seaworthiness management system will always be judged on the outcomes we produce. And the recent bushfire assist was particularly pleasing to see our Navy respond in the way it did when 10 years ago it couldn't.
Readying for battle in a war of a very different kind, HMAS Adelaide being loaded with supplies to join other ships already involved in one of the worst fire crises the country has seen.
In Eden Harbour, HMAS Adelaide, our Navy's biggest ship, and behind it, a constant reminder of an emergency that refuses to die. Helicopters are lifting supplies and equipment to shore, a lifeline for towns cut off for days. From a Navy launch, the Adelaide is a reassuring sight.
What we're doing is to insert liaison teams into isolated communities to determine what level of support may be required.
Defence has hundreds of tonnes of resource. There's water, food, radios, generators. It's like a mobile town waiting to be deployed.
They had 500 stretchers set up. Fortunately, we didn't need to use those, but they were ready at no notice to take Australians on board to that ship and take them to safety if needed. When we actually looked at the capability that we had sitting off the coast of New South Wales, we had the ability to lift 5,000 people and move them to safety if we needed to. We certainly could not have done that 10 years earlier.
The biggest sea evacuation in Australian history.
The Australian Navy will also deliver supplies and operations teams to fire-ravaged Malakuta. HMAS Chulz, supported by MV Sycamore, is due to arrive at 10 o'clock to help evacuate people stranded on shore.
Boatload after boatload of stranded tourists and residents have made the journey from Malakuta to HMAS Chulz in the biggest naval sea evacuation in Australia's history.
Solid ground and safety. Never felt so good.
Wonderful. Absolutely wonderful.
Amazing. Like, I'm so happy to be home. I'm happy to see my family.
I would not have envisaged that we'd be using Navy warships to evacuate Australians from coastal towns of New South Wales and Victoria. I would not have envisaged that I'd have 830 Navy people right now deployed across Australia, assisting as we battle the COVID-19 pandemic. So as I look through what's the important lessons in all of this, it comes back to the people. It comes back to them understanding their role as individuals, but more importantly, how when we come together in times of extreme emergency and extreme national response, the Navy team can deliver extraordinary results. Seaworthiness is now an integral part of that capability.
I think the Navy now is in a great position. It is due to that really hard work that was done, not just in between 11 and 14, but in the period after that. Every Chief of Navy, it's defined by a different set of things. Russ's time was defined early on by the cultural side and something that he worked really hard at and laid a fantastic foundation for us going forward. My time was defined by seaworthiness by and large. Tim's time was defined by building on that seaworthiness platform and then arguing the case for a range of new capabilities which we now have coming online.
Seaworthiness doesn't prevent you from doing things. It doesn't tie you to one particular outcome or not. It just gives you better information, not just in the operational here and now, but from a longer term sustainment point of view, so you can make better operational decisions. Seaworthiness is everything to do fundamentally of how Navy operates.
The whole seaworthiness journey has been one of continual evolution and change over the last 10 years. Where we find ourselves now is in a maturing thinking around what seaworthiness means to every woman and man in our Navy. They are part of it, they live with it, they understand what it means to them personally, they know what it means to their platform in which they're serving, and ultimately what we are able to build is a culture in our people who think about the importance of technical risk, of environmental compliance and operational excellence through the lens of defence seaworthiness. What we are now to assure ourselves through an independent defence assurance system is that our platforms and our people are able to operate in complex environments safely.
As discussed by Admiral Griggs, the report led by Mr. Paul Rizzo was entitled "The Plan to Reform Support Ship Repair and Management Practices," commissioned in the wake of both Cyclone Yahtzee and the near grounding of HMAS Canimbla. But it was about considerably more than just support ship repair and maintenance. Its themes applied across Navy and provided the blueprint for the development of the current Navy seaworthiness system. The report was summarised by the ABC as identifying organisational complexity and blurred accountabilities, inadequate risk management, poor compliance and assurance, a hollowed out Navy engineering function, resource shortages, and a culture that places the short-term operational missions above the need for technical integrity. The report also specifically addressed the functioning of the Navy technical regulatory system and identified 4 key criticisms of the system that led to its failure. The report found that whilst the NTRS had established authorised engineering organisations similar to those in aviation, they were all DMO or Navy organisations. When work is conducted in industry, no regulatory oversight was provided, instead relying on contract provisions to ensure compliance with requirements. This report also found that unlike aviation, there are no authorised maintenance organisations, where organisations are assessed and authorised on their ability to conduct maintenance safely, such as in defence aviation squadrons or in industry maintenance facilities. The instructions covering the policy aspects of the Navy technical regulatory system were written in 2002. The standards were principle-based, however, much of the information was out of date, spread across many documents, and required review to form a concise set of orders that were contemporary, easy to comprehend, and facilitate compliance. Whilst the regulations are comprehensive, compliance with them was found to be lacking. Reasons for non-compliance in Navy, other than the complexity of the orders themselves, included minimum manning of ships, changes in training regimes, poor configuration management data, and ongoing issues with information management systems, which place significant strains on ships maintenance teams. SPOs are struggling with an inadequate configuration baseline for a number of their platforms, an immature information management system, disruption caused by frequent organisational change, insufficient skilled personnel, and inefficient contracting mechanisms. All of these factors have combined to produce a backlog of engineering and maintenance tasks and a consequent reduced focus on compliance with technical regulatory requirements. The report identified that assurance activities have been inadequate. The AOs in Navy and DMO were audited only once every 3 years to renew their formal accreditation. There was little evidence that the performance of AEOs was regularly monitored, or that any risk assessment of the AEO's ability to adequately discharge its assigned function was carried out. The report identified that assurance activities have been, the basic cause of this shortcoming is the lack of resources being applied. When a comparison was made with the aviation sector, it was found that DGTA performs the regulatory function for aviation material with a staff of approximately 74 people. 10 writing and maintaining regulations, and another 64 performing the assurance function. In comparison, the same 2 tasks were performed in Navy by just 11 people. In June 2012, a joint directive was issued by the Secretary and CDF to the Chief of Navy authorising the development of the Defence Seaworthiness Management System. The directive identified CN as the Defence Seaworthiness Authority and subsequently H&E as the Defence Seaworthiness Regulator. Note, I said defence, not Navy. This directive is where the emergence of the seaworthiness outcome statement had its genesis to sustain the desired operational effect in a nominated environment, whilst binding adherence to following rules, procedures, processes articulated within defence policy. The Defence Seaworthiness Management System is how maritime capability is regulated within defence. It is goal-based, outcome-focused regulatory framework that places the obligation on the capability manager to manage hazards and risks within their context. This high-level obligation is codified through 15 governance and management compliance obligations, or GAMCOs, and 19 activity and condition-based compliance obligations, ACOs. These obligations require the capability manager to govern and manage their enterprise in a seaworthiness context, the GAMCOs, and to address the management of hazards and risks inherent at the mission system level of every naval ship, submarine, or defence vessel, the ACOs. The GAMCOs and ACOs constitute the regulations of the Defence Seaworthiness Management System, which collectively deliver the goals on which the system is based and the outcome to which it was designed to achieve, the seaworthiness outcome. While sounding complex, this can be illustrated relatively simply. As you just saw, the Defence Seaworthiness Management System defines a seaworthy outcome as one which maximises the likelihood of achieving an operational effect for the defined tasking where efforts have been made to eliminate or minimise, so far as is reasonably practicable, hazards or risks to personnel, the public, or the environment. The system requires that each maritime mission system be managed under a seaworthiness case. The seaworthiness case is a living body of information which together provides the context, claims, arguments, and evidence necessary to support seaworthiness judgments relating to the maritime mission system and its enabling support systems. The claim of a seaworthy maritime mission system is made and argued through the implementation of the compliance strategy within the context of each individual maritime mission system's operating and support intent. The operating and support intent is central to the management of seaworthiness. The Defence Seaworthiness Management System requires that a capability manager has an authorised operating and support intent for each maritime mission system. It consists of the requirements, constraints, and assumptions for the mission system. And in essence, it is the concept that ties together how a capability will be both operated and supported. It identifies that these two concepts are intrinsically linked and should remain balanced through the capability life cycle. Where there is an imbalance, for example, where there is an increased operational requirement which is provided at the expense of maintenance, then there is an increased risk of an unseaworthy outcome, as we saw with the LPAs at the start of the last decade. This is not to say that the seaworthiness system limits the ability of capability managers to deliver operational effect, but it does place obligations on them to manage the risks associated with doing so, now and across the whole capability life cycle, and not to blindly borrow from tomorrow's Navy to meet the operational needs of today. Navy's response to the Defence Seaworthiness regulations, how it meets its compliance obligations, are codified in the N library. This library provides a common logical and hierarchical structure for the 8 sub-libraries that contain Navy's critical knowledge management references and are seen in the image on the left. The N library establishes clear authority and accountability for policy development and implementation. And whilst I don't expect you to be able to see it in detail, the figure on the right is an exploded view of the N4 library set, which covers Navy's response to material seaworthiness obligations, including the policy on seaworthiness management, upgrade, upkeep, update of material, and how we conduct seaworthiness assurance within the material seaworthiness frame. At the heart of the material seaworthiness construct is an entity called an AMSDO, an authorised material seaworthiness delivery organisation. If you work in or with Defence, this is most likely touch point that you'll have with our seaworthiness system. It's a re-imaging of the old SPO and engineering organisation constructs to provide an integration of engineering, maintenance and supply support functions to our fleet. It is structured around authorised organisations, AEOs, AMOs and ASOs with qualified, experienced, authorised and accountable principals, principal engineers, support managers and maintenance managers, working to an executive consisting of both an NSSG, CASG or DMO director and a Navy capability manager representative. Integrated first line of defence assurance is provided by the class lifecycle engineering officer charged with ensuring the system's ability to deliver a seaworthiness outcome through the capabilities lifecycle, supported by my organisation, the MISWA, providing second line of defence assurance. This model is the organisational construct used for the delivery of a seaworthy fleet to our Navy. Seaworthiness has adopted a system of assurance based on a 3-line of defence governance framework. The third line of defence develops the rules and regulations that govern the system. It then monitors and assures that systemic and emerging risks are identified, managed and remediated by capability managers through adherence to the Defence Seaworthiness Management System regulations. The second line of defence builds the organisation's compliance strategy to the regulations, its systems response to the requirements and conducts assurance activities to provide confidence in the integrity of the system, which has been used to develop the seaworthiness case. The first line of defence establishes and maintains the seaworthiness case. It does this through a robust set of processes, plans and controls that comply with the seaworthiness system to deliver the outcome. In essence, it is the first physical checkpoint that assures controls directly applied through the ACOs are being effectively implemented to minimise the short to medium term hazards to the mission system. In navies versus the Defence's seaworthiness system, implementation of this governance and assurance model is achieved through the implementation and assurance against the N library. My organisation, the Navy Material Seaworthiness Assurance Agency, which has probably got the worst title of all agencies in defence, conducts assurance at the second line of defence over the material seaworthiness policies and systems established in the Tier 2 and 3 documents of the N library. Embedded CLEOs and FLEOs, Class Lifecycle Engineering Officers and Force Lifecycle Engineering Officers, conduct assurance at the first line of defence over the processes and procedures established by delivery organisations to deliver the seaworthiness case. This is typically managed by a series of interrelated systems hosted in the Navy Assurance Management System. So let's compare the systems. In reviewing both systems, some comparisons are inevitably drawn. Both reflect modern outcome-based regulatory suites, although in my opinion, the seaworthiness system has more fully embraced a goal-based regulatory framework. Whilst both are concerned with safety, they differ in that aviation explicitly does not regulate capability, while seaworthiness exists to regulate the nexus between capability and safety. I contend this is largely informed by the events that have shaped their evolution. As we've seen, the formative aviation events are nearly always safety critical events, while naval events are as often capability centric, as with Cyclone Yahtzee. Both have now established clear lines of accountabilities where duty holders within the system have a clear understanding of their accountabilities and responsibilities and their obligation under the WHS Act. Both systems represent contemporary best practice for their environments. However, the seaworthiness system is still bespoke to the RAN, whereas aviation regulation is based off an internationally credible and defensible recognised standard. The establishment of the Australian Naval Classification Agency and the formal integration of classification society rules will seek to remediate some of this. Finally, both systems have adopted a risk-based assurance frame. However, aviation has no intermediary. The regulator is also the assurance agency and operates on a two-tier system via the 3 lines of defence implemented within the seaworthiness system. And finally, I just want to let you know, I am passionate about this topic of safety regulation. Most of you will see a picture of 9 individuals up here, but for me, I see Kingy, Maddie Goodall, Paul Kimlin, and Scotty Bennett, members of the Fleet Air Arm that I've worked with or had a beer with in the wardroom, or whose partners worked in our community, and in some cases, whose kids went to school with other Fleet Air Arm kids. This topic is important to me. Thank you for taking the time to spend a little bit of it with me this evening.